Hi Sylvia, how are you today? And I hope you've got the whole family with you at this important occasion. Let me begin by thanking the Rockefeller Institute and the FDR Presidential Library for co-hosting this event, where we can celebrate the life of a wonderful man who was so closely affiliated with Rockefeller and with FDR. He worked for Rockefeller, he wrote about Rockefeller, and then later in life he developed a passion for Franklin Delano Roosevelt and wrote some brilliant books about the passion that he had for the man and who the man was. In my case, he entered my life in the fall of 1993. I was still the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but I had decided at that time, just before retirement, that I would write a book about my life experiences up to that point. And I had a little trouble finding a collaborator. I interviewed a number of people and it just didn't click, didn't work out. And in my last month of office as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I was starting to get a little worried that I wouldn't find somebody who would fit. And then my agent called me and said, there's this fellow Persico who's just written the book, he's finished it, and he's got some time on his hands now, and maybe you want to talk to him. He's a New York guy like you, and maybe something will click, I don't know. So anyway, we set up an appointment, and when the time came, my secretary called me in my wonderful office as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Armed Forces of the United States and said, Mr. Persico is here. And the door opened and in walked Joe Persico, kind of rumpled and slightly disheveled, gray hair going in all directions, that old briefcase that he always carried. And I watched him as he crossed the room. I didn't go over to greet him, I just wanted him to come to me. And as he crossed the room, I couldn't help but note that he was not looking at me at all. He was looking at the room. You could see him going all around the room, taking in the room. And I knew at that point, this guy is good. He's trying to get the scene set before he even starts talking to me. And then he sat down and we started a conversation about our background and what we wanted in this book. I made it clear to him, as I had made clear to my publishers and agents, that I was not going to tell any tales about anybody I worked for. It was going to be about my life as a soldier and as a kid growing up. Joe understood that perfectly. Joe had never been a collaborator before. He'd always been an author of the highest level. And all I know is that I clicked with this guy. He just clicked immediately. And as soon as he left the office after our conversation and what he expected of me and what I expected of him, I immediately called my agent and I said, we've got our collaborator, let's get him. And that was the beginning of a wonderful relationship and a wonderful friendship that lasted until his passing away from us. When we started working together in October of 1993, and he thought that we should start the book with a scene from Desert Storm, the major military activity in my career. And we spent a whole week, more than a week, talking about Desert Storm, talking about me, Norm Schwarzkopf, Dick Cheney, all the other players that were in the Desert Storm game. And after about a week or so, we finished it up. It went back up to New York for Vanya and you, Sylvia, to convert into words on a piece of paper. And then he came back the next week and said, okay, now let's talk about your family. Let's talk a little bit about your upbringing. And then we started a long conversation that took more than a week about my being born in New York, growing up in an immigrant family, my public school education, and everything you could think of with respect to my early years. Just sort of setting the tone for the book. And he came back after thinking about it and reading all of that, and he had an idea. He walked in and he said, that's how we start the story. That's the story, not Desert Storm. Everybody's seen Desert Storm on television. Everybody knows what it's all about, but this is the story. And that's how the book began, with a story about my background, my growing up in New York, and we just dived into it. And over the next year or so, as we prepared this book, I got to know a lot about Joe, and Joe got to know a lot about me. He probably knows as much about me as did my wife, Alma. And what I found sitting and talking with Joe is that he was a master of the art of writing. He taught me so many things that I would not have learned otherwise. I'm a pretty good storyteller, and I'm not a bad writer, but nobody could shape my words or writing as much as Joe, and as well as Joe could, and demonstrated to me. And he taught me a lot of things. He taught me not to put the names of all of my friends in the book. And I said, but they're my friends. They're all looking for their name. What am I going to do? He said, look, we're not selling this book for your 200 friends. We're selling it for 2 million people. They all can't go in the book. Okay, so a lot of friends dropped on the cutting room floor. And then he said, when you tell a story, it has to have a point. You can't have a story without a point. I said, okay, I got it. And then sometimes I would come back with a story again and a point, and he would say, we made that point already, therefore the story can't be in it. You can only do it once. You got to keep the story moving. And he taught me the importance of keeping a flow in writing. And the publisher, Random House, said, after you guys have finished one chapter, send it to us. We want to see what it looks like and whether or not Joe has captured your voice. Does it really sound like you, or does it sound like Joe pretending to be you? And so we sent that first chapter up to Random House, and they liked it very much, and they said, he's got it. You guys are a team. We don't want to hear from you again until you're finished, and then send us the whole manuscript. And that's what we did for the next year plus. And Joe kept pulling things out of me. Whenever he thought I was holding back, unconsciously or consciously, he would dive in and dig it out of me. What did you really think of your sister? I said, Joe, I already talked about my sister. No, you didn't. You didn't tell me enough about your sister or your parents or your growing up. And so we just kept peeling back my onion until Joe got to the core of the story. The story I'll never forget with respect to Joe is that after we had really moved along with the book, everything was going splendidly. I had reached the pinnacle of my career. I was now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces of the United States. And a lot of things happened then. We had Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the invasion of Panama, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. My challenge was in rebuilding the armed forces for a different enemy that we didn't know who it would be, and also for a smaller force. I did all of those things, and I was very proud of what I'd done, and we started to talk about all of that. And one week, Joe came in and said, well, you know, we're well into this, but let me tell you something. It is boring. Boring? What do you mean boring? He said, I don't care what you think. I don't care about any of this stuff. It's all boring and everybody knows it. So we ought to stop now. No, Joe, it's my life. It's my career. We got to go through the whole thing. All right. And so he turned me into my publisher in New York. And Harry Evans, my editor and publisher, a great man, called and said, you know, Joe really thinks it's boring and so do I. I said, well, that's too bad. He said, well, it's your book. Okay. So the book went from 400 to 600 pages because it had to cover my career as a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we fussed about it, but we did it that way, and that's how the book was printed and published and is now out in some 2.2 million versions and copies of it in many different languages. But the upshot of it all is that after 19 years in circulation, it is now the beginning of the 20th year since the book was released, I haven't had two questions about the second half of the book with respect to my time as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All the questions I get have to do with that immigrant upbringing in New York City, my early years in the Army, what I learned, the stories of people I ran into in the course of my early years. And so Joe was right, but I still had to write it even if it didn't make him completely happy. Joe was a master. He taught me so much about how to write and how to keep a story moving. In fact, my next book, It Worked for Me in Life and Leadership, draws from the first book and essentially reflects the lessons I learned from Joe about writing. A master biographer, a master collaborator, and I'm the only one he's ever collaborated with, and I'm proud of that. He did a great turn for me, and most importantly, after we finished the book and it was out, we stayed in touch. We stayed in touch up until the very end of his distinguished life. We stayed in touch with Sylvia, and we kept track of each other's families. He became my dear friend as well as my collaborator. And I was never able to fully capture what he meant to me, but I put a sentence in the book that means a lot to me and it meant a lot to Joe. But in the acknowledgement section, I said, this is my story, but it is our book. It was our book. Joe and I wrote that book together. He would make a draft of a chapter. I would rip it up and rewrite it. It would go back to Joe, come back to me. We did it over and over until we were satisfied with it. And it became a bestseller because it was my story, but also especially because it was our book, my book, and Joe Persico's book. I miss him. I know you all will miss him, but I'm sure this conference will give you an opportunity to reflect on what he has accomplished in his lifetime, and it will give you a chance to reflect on the great historical figures that he was so much an admirer of and wrote so well about, Nelson Rockefeller and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Thank you and have a great time.